So here we have our two carburetors off of our Suzuki Titan 500. And as you can see, this carburetor is looking pretty rough. It's far from the worst one I've ever seen, but it's pretty gunked up from sitting in a barn. It's definitely an eyesore. Internally, it looks pretty good. The throttle slide still moves and it's not all corroded inside, so we should have no problem cleaning it up. And you can tell from this one, there really is a nice carburetor hiding in there. So, you got your carburetor on your bench. Comes off the bike using your spigot clamp. Oftentimes you're gonna have to take your air box off or some sort of boot or something. And then you probably have your throttle cable holding this part of the carburetor on yet. This particular Mikuni has a strange setup where the throttle cable goes into the slide. And to be honest, it was already apart. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take this cap off. There's a lot of threads, it's gonna take a while. And there's gonna be a spring behind here. That's what's gonna return the throttle slide back down. It's not really gonna fly off. Normally that's gonna be connected to your throttle cable still. But be aware the spring is there, and be aware that there's a rubber little gasket right here. You need to have that. So we're gonna set those aside. So next thing, I probably want to get this choke mechanism out of my way. So it's kind of tight. You're going to use, I believe that's a 12 millimeter. These choke mechanisms are going to vary bike to bike, and since you get very few turns out of it, it's going to take a while. So now this whole choke plunger assembly comes out. There's often some sort of gasket or O-ring here. And then let's set that aside. And now it's time to really dig into this thing. So there's that piece of the throttle slide I was telling you about. So the way this one actually works is the cable goes right into that little slot, and then that little locking mechanism locks it in. But sometimes they're all different. Some use a little E-clip. It's gonna vary carburetor to carburetor. So now let's dig into this thing. We're gonna see what's inside. Get yourself a good condition Phillips screwdriver to do this. And I know you wanna use the impact, but it's a good way to ruin the screws. Ask me how I know. And it should go without saying, keep all this stuff straight and organized as you're taking it apart. And there's a lot of threads on these little guys. So all of these bowls are gonna have 4 screws on them, and when you get those screws out, the bowl's not gonna wanna come off. There's a little gasket sandwiched in there. Now, commonplace, people always talk about a carburetor rebuild kit. 99% of the times with these Mikuni round slide carburetors, you're not gonna need a rebuild kit. You're gonna clean all your jets, and your gasket is often, most all the time, gonna come out in one piece. But this is where it pays to take a little care. So to get this carb bowl to come off, you can use the backside of a screwdriver, give it a couple taps. Here it broke loose. So now this is where you want to be careful and watch your gasket. See, there's that gasket, and it came off on one side. It didn't try to stick. Sometimes if it tries to stick to opposing sides, you can slide a little screwdriver in there to make it come off with one side. So here we are inside the carburetor. It's not that dirty. And you can also see this is an old brass float carburetor, which a lot of times you're gonna see plastic. And with these brass floats, you always wanna test them because they can get a pinhole in them and fill with gas and then sink, and you're gonna have an issue there. So we'll set the bowl aside for now. We'll clean that up later. And now let's continue disassembling this thing. So I like to get the floats out of my way. This one's gonna be really easy because the pin is loose. So it probably just knock out. One thing you really want to note here is this hole is actually tapered. So sometimes you have, the pin will have like a nail end on it, a wide end, and it only wants to go in one way and out one way, and you gotta be aware of that because the holes are tapered. So just don't force it. So we pull the pin in our float assembly, and then we have our needle and seat. So the needle will have this little spring retainer on it. Some of them do, some of them don't. It just retains the needle in the seat. So to get that clip off, you want to be very careful and not lose it. I just turn it and then pull it towards me, make sure it doesn't fly away. So now we're gonna have our needle. This is an older style needle. Sometimes the tip of this will have a rubberized coating on it called Viton. It just helps with sealing, but a lot of these old ones won't. So to get the seat out, we're gonna go to our 9mm socket. And the seat's gonna have a little O-ring on it. Just turn the seat a little bit and that O-ring will come out. And there it goes. We'll find that later. All right, next step is the main jet. On this particular carburetor, we've got a straight screw style main jet. A lot of them are gonna be hex. So get the right size screwdriver, pull it out. And then there's oftentimes gonna be a little washer here. Just you can use the main jet to pull it out or a pick or something. But be careful when you do this. You don't wanna ruin the threads. All right. Now this one can be a little tricky. This is the pilot jet, is in this circuit right here. So this is where I said you're gonna need that skinny screwdriver because it has to fit in there. So obviously it's a very small opening. Now, another thing that can happen is this carburetor can be so gunked up that this pilot jet can get stuck in there. It's a very small straight blade. So when you go to take it out, apply downward pressure and ease it out. So here we have our pilot jet. So we're most of the way there. The next thing I always like to do is take out the emulsion tube. This is another one that can get a little tricky. There's oftentimes old corrosion and stuff in here that emulsion tube is not gonna want to come out. Sometimes you can try to just push on it or whatever, but it's not gonna want to come out. And again, soft metal. You don't want to go hit this with like a screwdriver or something because those threads will get ruined. So what I like to do is I go for a socket that matches that diameter without being small that you'll get into those threads in the emulsion tube. So center it. Give it a couple taps. And then you can see it sticking out in the carburetor. Grab onto it with 2 fingers, pull it out. So there we have our emulsion tube and it's got some nasty gas on it. Basically the purpose of this is it interfaces with the jet needle and changes your fuel delivery based on the profile of that jet needle. All right, so now that we're this far down, since this carburetor is so gross, I'm gonna take a couple more things off. This is your idle speed screw. It just has a little cone end on it. And that is gonna work with the throttle slide. Just basically it's gonna stop it. And you can see you get a little bit of, that's where your adjustment comes in. Now that we're down this far, basically all we have left is the air screw, the idle air screw. And that's it on the car body itself. So you always want to refer to your manufacturer specifications on this because this air screw is threaded out a certain amount of turns from bottomed out. So if you don't have your specifications handy, you always should, but now is when it pays to take your Sharpie, make a little reference mark, and count the number of turns when you take it out. Of course, that's actually useless because you want to count how many turns it is from bottomed out. If your carburetor's not in terrible shape like this one is, you're not usually taking this out, but again, the amount of turns it is from bottomed out. So make a reference mark and turn the screw half at a time, count the amount of turns. All right, so now the car body's all disassembled. On this particular carburetor, we've also got this little jet in the bowl here. Ooh, and that one is pretty stuck. Really stuck. And I'm pretty sure this is going to have a little gasket ring on it, so make sure you have that. Yep, and you can see our gasket is actually stuck in there, so we need to get that out. Make sure we don't lose track of it. I'll probably pull that out with a pick. All right, so now that we're this far assembled, it's time to get everything straightened away and start cleaning. All right, so this is really dirty. You're gonna wanna do this over a garbage can or something. Carb cleaner's expensive, so kind of wanna use it sparingly. So I'm gonna go to my brush, start knocking some of this stuff off. This is again another time it really pays to have the brass brush because as you can tell, we're not scratching up the carburetor body. And as you can see, that's already getting us a huge amount of the way there. So I'm gonna scrub on this for another 10 minutes and we'll come back. All right, so as you can see, our carburetor body's starting to look a lot better. It's still not perfect. There's more scrubbing we could do. This is just with brake clean, a pick, and our brass brush. If you want to get in some of these really tight areas, it's just all about how much time you want to spend. But what we want to be sure we do at this step is clean out all the little passageways inside the carburetor. So we've got our float circuit, where our emulsion tube goes, our pilot circuit, vents, and everything else. Fuel inlet. So you're gonna wanna take your brake clean and watch your eyes and spray out all these surfaces, all these passageways. So after you give that a good long spray, the next thing you want to do is go for your compressed air and just blow the whole thing off. And then you're going to want to take your compressed air and blow out every one of those passageways. All right, so here we have some of our jets and other parts of the carburetor laid out. It's time to clean these. This is really the most important thing you're doing in a carb cleaning. So a lot of times when an engine won't run, it's because the small orifices in these jets have plugged up. You can see they're really small and really prone to any sort of junk getting stuck in there from old gas or whatever. This pilot jet right here is going to be a common culprit. It's got very small holes in it, and it's going to control some of your low throttle running conditions. So that one is often going to be your culprit, and it has these small little holes in it. When you're done, you want to make sure all those holes along the side are clean. So we're going to clean these up the old-fashioned way with carb cleaner and compressed air. So it's pretty simple. Just take your jet, take your carb cleaner, and you're going to want to aim this somewhere safe, and just go into the jet and spray it out. I recommend you wear some safety glasses when you do this, because you're going to get carburetor or cleaner or brake clean in your eye, and it happens pretty much almost every time. So now you're going to take your compressed air and blow this out. So now if we look through the jet, we can see light through it. You don't see any dark area. The jet's clean inside. You can take a wire brush, clean it up a little more. Brass is good to use for this over a steel wire brush. But you don't want to just be ramming, a hard steel something through the jet. Could change the size of the orifice. So we're going to go through and do that with all of our jets. Next, with the pilot. As you can see, we're looking a little better. Again, take your brush, clean some of the junk off of it. And yeah, that's pretty much the process, and we're gonna go through all the jets and clean them up, and then we're gonna move on to the carburetor body. So here we've got our carburetor bowl. Cleaning this thing is a lot of the same. Brushing, brake cleaning, compressed air. But what we really want to look at right now is the inside of this bowl is full of sediment. You actually see that in the center of the bowl is kind of a little area where sediment's designed to settle. So take a small brass brush, clean the bowl inside the bowl out. You can use a small screwdriver or something to clean out that sediment bowl. And then the outside is just going to be a lot of the same. All right. So as you can see, our carb body turned out pretty good. We did run this through the ultrasonic cleaner, just shine it up a little more. But you don't need to with brake cleaner and enough brass wire brushes. You can get a pretty good result. So this is the gasket I was talking about before. It's still in one piece, and again, 99% of the time, if that gasket is still in one piece, you're not going to have any problems. So on to assembly. You can see we got all of our parts clean, laid out, and I like to start with the emulsion tube. Now, when you disassemble your carburetor, now's the time when you want to take your Sharpie and write down what you got. Write down your main jet numbers, write down your pilot jet numbers, your emulsion tube, your jet needle. Make sure everything matches. Make sure it matches what manufacturer specification is for your carburetor. So, to insert the emulsion tube, go from the top, and this part's important. So there's a slot on the side of the emulsion tube right here, and that lines up with a stud that's in here. So it goes one way, and the way I always remember it is when I'm looking down in the carburetor, putting this thing in, the open side of this goes towards the engine. The closed side over here goes to the airbox. So it can be a little tricky, but just put a couple fingers into the carburetor from each side. And I'm gonna need to turn this towards me to do it. And make sure you line it up square, because that stud and that slot, it's only gonna go one way. And it can be a little bit of a pain to get started. Get square. Here's what I'm doing. Just squaring it up and just sort of give it a little wiggle, and it's gonna start to fall down in place. Sometimes you gotta go in from the top, and then boom, it's gonna land right in where it goes. So make sure it's bottomed out. I like to hold it in there while I grab my washer, the main jet. So here we have our main jet. Again, this is a slotted screw type main jet. A lot of the other ones are gonna be hex. They have a little number on them. So for example, this is well, we'll just cut while I get my magnifying glasses and assume that that's correct for our purposes today. So line it up. You don't have to tighten this very tight. It's brass, you can mar it up just tight enough. Next, we're gonna move on to the pilot jet. Pilot jet also has numbers on it. They're very small. So verify you have the right one. So drop the pilot jet in right there. Take your small straight screwdriver, skinny enough to fit down in there. And be careful until you feel it start to get tight. You don't want to screw this up because it's a pain to get out if you strip it. So I'm being very careful until I just feel it get tight, and just give it enough. So next, we're gonna move on to the needle in the seat. So when you go to reinstall your seat, look down into the center of it. You wanna verify that there's no corrosion or anything down in the center of that seat. And the same goes for the tip of the needle. These two pieces need to have a good, clean fit, or it's gonna leak. Sometimes you'll deal with a carburetor on something that's hard starting, it doesn't wanna run unless it's got a lot of throttle applied or something like that. A needle in seat generally causes conditions like that. You'll be able to know that that's happening if carburetor is running out of one of your vent lines. So make sure that's clean, make sure it's got a good fit. You can also test this actually. One thing I'll do is when my carburetor is done and assembled, I take some sort of reservoir, put it up high. I use an old oil tank actually, and I run a line down to the fuel barb. Hook it up, put gas in it. Take this carburetor and set it with that fuel gravity feeding into it for a few minutes. And then peek inside the carburetor, and if you see gas inside of it, obviously you don't want to be angling it around when it's full of gas, that's not a good test. But if you see gas coming out of that carburetor, then that means your needle and seat is not sealing. Another little benefit to that is no hard starting. The bowl's full of gas now, install it back on your bike or whatever, and the bowl's full. You don't have to pull or kick or crank a lot to get gas to the carburetor. So we take our needle and seat. We luckily found our little spring. Don't lose it again. Ease it onto its slot, just like that. Then you'll always have a little O-ring that goes bottom, your needle and seat, and then install it. Goes right here. So in our application, this is a 9mm. Again, just enough. Okay, so now I just like to straighten this little clip up. It doesn't really, I don't think it can interfere with the float level anyway, but straighten that up. Now again, we have our old brass floats. A lot of later carburetors are gonna have like a composite float. These brass floats, you wanna check those. So when you have your carburetor apart, stick these under water or whatever and hold them down there for a while, and they should want to float back to the surface. When you take it out, shake the float around. Does it feel like there's fluid in it? If that's the case, it's gonna stick. You're gonna have issues with your needle and seat not shutting. So if you have this apart and you want a quick and easy way to know which way it goes back together, look at the little tab. You'll see a little center mark. That's where it's been hitting the needle. So that little tab right there is also going to be what establishes your float height. This little tab gets bent up or down to change the float height. So we can see that better once we get the float back installed. So we got our pin. Remember, it's going to have one way it likes to come apart and go back together, and that one I got right on the first try. So as you can see, that little tab is hitting the needle and seat, and that's what's shutting off the fuel. To change your float height is where this float is in its travel when you just set it down. You bend this tab, don't bend anything else, you bend this tab up or down. A lot of times, Mikuni float is generally set to where the float level is level with the carburetor body. So this one, I don't have the specs for our Suzuki on hand, and that bike's not gonna run for a while, so I'm gonna leave it where it is, but look up your bike, your manufacturer is gonna tell you where that should be set. All right. So we have most things put back together on the carb body. I'm gonna move over to the bowl for a second here. This carburetor uses this jet in the bottom that goes down in the bottom of the bowl. Works in conjunction with the main jet. It's kind of an unusual setup. Our O-rings actually, or our gasket's actually trashed there. We need a new one for our purposes today. Put it back in. All right, sometimes, like some other carburetors, some later ones, they'll actually have a couple studs that come out of the bowl, and that's gonna be where your composite float rides on. Those are a little easier to work on, but that's not the setup we have here on our 70s Suzuki. So we're done with the bowl now. So we've got everything complete inside the carburetor. So the bowl's gonna go on now, and you just match the posts for the float, match here. And as you can see, our gasket's in one piece. Our gasket surface is pretty clean, and put it together. So this is kind of a critical step. Make sure that that bowl lands in the right spot. If you just sort of set it down it can kind of go off to one side. You can start putting screws in and bind something up. So set it in there, wiggle it, and then start. I like to start 2 opposing screws and just start them. Get 2 other ones started, and then start bringing them down sort of together. These have a little lock washer on them, so you don't have to crank them down. Just make sure they're tight enough and even. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is, that was our idle air screw. One thing I missed before was this little spring. That little spring goes down in the bottom of that hole. So, put it back. Take our straight blade screwdriver, screw it in until it bottoms out. Don't crank on it because you'll just screw up the straight blade screw, but put it in until it bottoms out, which is right there. So I go to my carb spec, and I'm gonna make a little reference mark on this, on the screw itself and right next to it. So now I go to my manufacturer specifications. For the air screw, it's how many turns out. So sometimes it's 3/4, sometimes it's 1 turn, sometimes it's 1.5 turns. Let's just say for this carburetor, my spec is 1.5 turns. So I turn half, 1, half, and I had to go back a half turn. 1.5 turns. So next thing we can do is put in our idle speed screw. So you can see this one has a spring and a little cup. You can kind of see how it goes back together. This little cup locates on the spring. And that's just to provide some tension on the screw so this just doesn't loosen up. So put that in. You know, when you take this apart, maybe put a reference mark on it. If it was a running bike, make a reference mark, you kind of know where it's at, and make sure they're both equal. But when you actually go to fine tune your bike, one good idea to do is to take your slide, and people use basically a drill bit, should correspond to how much. You can basically use a certain size drill bit to even up, to synchronize your 2 carburetors. I don't really do that a lot. Just make sure they're even, make sure they both, when they both start to move, they're moving together. So, again, your throttle slide, the slot corresponds to a little stud that's in there. It can only go in one way. Just wiggle it, find stud, spring. Again, you might have a throttle cable connected to all this, so this is all gonna come out with the throttle cable. But cap, it's got our rubber washer. I missed something. So again, since this doesn't actually have a throttle cable connected to it, I missed our little lock. That can only go in one way. That's the way that goes. These can kind of be a little bit of a pain to line up. Don't force it, it'll go. All right, The last thing we need is our choke plunger. So on this particular carburetor, there's a little tab that locates it. Remember, that's our 12mm. These chokes are another thing that you'll want to have synchronized. On this set of carburetors, you have a little link bar, a little set screw like this. Some cable type chokes, you synchronize with an amount of free play. You'll have a specification for it. And with our carburetors next to each other, you can see this lock screw and this ferrule right here, which is for your throttle cable, and that's how you actually adjust each side to synchronize them. See, this is bent and they're way out of adjustment, but we don't have a cable on here, so we're not worrying about that today. But as you can see now, we've got our two carburetors looking good. You know, when we first tore into these, they were pretty gross. I wouldn't have thought they would clean up this good. So that's it for today. You know, when you go to put stuff back together, just refer to your manufacturer specifications for everything and jet from there. So for next time, if you guys like this video, we got another set. And we got something a little different in mind. I bet my buddy that I could take this set of carburetors apart and put it back together blindfolded. So, sounds easy to me. If you want to see that, let us know. Catch you later.